another way to put this maybe would be like giving someone a lobotomy. Let's imagine that whatever we call free will is a faculty. I think it's a faculty of something called the soul or the self. I think the self is transcendent to the physical world, but let's just talk in biological terms and say that this faculty is structured in your brain somewhere. Whereas if to the extent where if we give you a lobotomy, we have eradicated your, not eradicated, but we have greatly limited your faculty of free will. Do you think technology has a capacity for lobotomy? And do you think if people with the levers of technology who don't believe in free will, would they not view technology that would lobotomize us as a threat?
I mean, for me personally, I do think, there is that possibility of technology or different media, in effect, lobotomizing you. I think, sometimes I wonder that about my students, but I won't. I won't elaborate on that point. All right. So hello, I'm David Dennen talking to Daniel Tarpy. We're going to discuss be talking about the free will issue today, the free will debate. It's been kind of a popular issue recently, partly, I think, because of this book, Robert Sapolsky's Determined. And there was another book. So Sapolsky is arguing against the existence of free will. Then there was another book about the same time last year, Kevin Mitchell's Free Agents, which is arguing for free will. And Mitchell and Sapolsky did a debate, and Sapolsky has recently debated Daniel Dennett, and Mitchell debated Susan Blackmore, who thinks free will is an illusion. And there's been a lot of other debates kind of around that. So now we're going to try to discuss this, and I think we have slightly different ways of coming at it. And yeah, so should I introduce some of the...
Could you give us an overview of these positions for Sapolsky and Kevin Mitchell?
Yeah, so sure. Yeah, so I'd say maybe the debate, kind of the basis for the historical basis for the debate comes out of two kind of common sense observations. One is that we seem to be able to choose different things. We can make choices, and you could maybe think about those as being free some of the time. And then there's another observation, which is that we usually seem to find an explanation for things, for why things happen. We can take an event, and we like to find explanations for why did that happen. And these two observations seem to be in tension with each other. And so if you think that being able to explain an event, why something happens, if you think that means that therefore, in principle, things are predictable, everything has a cause, then you come down more on the side of what's called determinism. You think that the future follows from the past, cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, on and on into infinity. That's more like a deterministic position. And then there are other people like, there's other positions, more libertarian. They call this in philosophy libertarianism, which is different than of course, the political view, although they could be related. But libertarianism, you believe more that there is freedom, there is less, that our choices are less related to prior causes. And there's different ways of looking at this. Kind of a hardcore position would be that we are, at least some of the time, able to have actions that are not caused, uncaused actions, or as like unmoved movers. Someone like Mitchell, and I find this with a lot of the recent, 20th and 21st century writings on free will, is that what they're really interested in is the concept of self-control. So they're not so much interested in, is this action caused or uncaused, but how do we evolve self-control? And this is really like Daniel Dennett's position. When Daniel Dennett talks about free will, he's usually, as far as I can tell, talking about self-control. Kevin Mitchell, I think, is largely talking about how do we come to have control of ourselves in order to make decisions, and whether that's whether you need determinism or need indeterminism for self-control to happen is an interesting question. Kevin Mitchell, I think, thinks there's much more indeterminism. He takes more of an indeterminist position based on, I think, developments in physics and quantum physics. So yeah, those are at least
we'll have to we'll get to that later about whether it is agency, unmoved mover agency, or if it's some kind of selecting through different options or possibilities. But then we have, like, Daniel Dennett is kind of a compatibilist, right? So we have that whole, I mean, I don't see how that's very coherent, but that is one other avenue to this free will discussion. But you also mentioned another one that would be more in line with you, which would be pragmatist, right? Can you explain that one a little bit?
Sure, I'll try. So yeah, my intellectual background, or I guess the tradition that I tend to identify with, is pragmatism. And pragmatists have had an interesting position on this debate, I think. They're usually not considered much when people talk about free will and determinism, which I think is precisely because they think it's a kind of a wrong question. William James actually is sometimes brought up because he tried to develop his own view of free will and determinism. He thought determinism was a useful perspective in science, but he also held to a kind of free will. He thought it must be possible to change our future, that it wasn't all determined, that we had to be able to make the world better through our actions, which maybe is not how people usually think about free will. But he felt that we had kind of the power to improve the world through our actions. But I think generally, after William James, I think pragmatists have generally criticized both the free will and deterministic positions. So Dewey, for example, rejects the concept of free will. He's interested in choice. And I think to explain choice, you don't need this extra concept of free will. You can just talk about choice. And he thought there was a lot of drawbacks to the term free will. It made things seem very more, seem much more individualistic or personal, or something kind of hidden and interior, whereas Dewey tended to look to the outside world, to the public world, to politics, to economics, in order to understand our freedom, to social life. So he found the basis for freedom in social life, not in some mysterious free will faculty. But he also critiqued determinism, on the other hand. And he thought developments, he lived, of course, longer than someone like William James. Dewey lived until 1950 something. So anyway, he experienced kind of these paradigm shifts in physics with quantum physics and with the theory of relativity. And he had to try to take account of that into his philosophy. And he thought these developments undermined traditional determinism. So he thought determinism, as it's been traditionally understood, was not viable. And he had a lot of qualms about free will as a concept as well. So he focused on freedom. How do human societies make themselves more free? How do they support freedom for the people who live in them? And and education. How do we improve intelligent choice? Those were his main kind of concerns.
Yeah, this takes us to the first, I think, the first problem, or in the free will discussion, there's a misconception of what we mean when we say free will. Like, what are we actually talking about? And it seems that some of us, some philosophers at least, were talking about the metaphysical concept of free will. And other people are talking more about the practice or the exercising of that free will. And that can lead to people talking, like I heard one of the podcasts I was listening to, that they're arguing, but from totally different positions of, going over each other. So from my perspective, to me, I think of free will in a metaphysical concept, which would be, like you mentioned before, about an unmoved mover. And I see agency as a feature of consciousness. It's the capacity for self-cause action, this choosing faculty, rather than exercising of this faculty. So a lot of these pragmatists or compatibilists, they're talking about free will kind of like on a surface level, where they're talking about the exercising of the free will. But for me, it's do humans have the capacity for agency? Are they agents in that sense? So would it matter like, it wouldn't matter to talk about degrees of freedom or determined versus influence, because we can imagine, like, if you take someone and tie them up so they can't move at all, they're unable to move, we would still say, well, you know, in normal terms, we would still say that person is free, has free will. They can't exercise a free will because they're constrained, or they're influenced, or they're determined to not be able to move. But they are still of the being that is capable or that has free will. So I think that's the first part of the discussion that gets into conflict with people from different perspectives or backgrounds. So for me, the free will is not that the person is able to move or able to will their movements, because they could be constrained, but that they are that which is capable of, or that which, as its nature and its essence, has this faculty, which we call agency or free will.
Mm. Yeah. So there was, I think the older Greek idea about free will was more about free action. And then like more modern ideas have more to do, I think, with desires, the ability to choose and things like that. So tying someone up would not necessarily, of course, not get rid of your desires to be free, for example. So I don't think, I mean, still would not necessarily describe that as having free will. Someone ties you up, you still have agency, for example, or you have, how do we want to just talk about that? And so it's not a matter of just what you can actually do. And also, I think pragmatism, you would want to point out that it's not a matter of individual, it's not so useful necessarily to look at this individual in this circumstance. You want to look at groups of individuals across many circumstances and see what are they capable of doing, what can't they do, things like that. What do they usually do? What are exceptions, and things like that. So, I mean, you wouldn't just take a person who's tied up as a kind of norm, but you would be able to observe them before they were tied up and maybe after they were tied up and be able to see that they made choices about what to do and that kind of thing. And that's kind of where.
But this takes us to another idea, which is, as much as I don't like Daniel Dennett's compatibilism, because I think it's incoherent in its nature and the nature of its argument. But he did write a book called, I think it's called Evolving Freedom, which I happen to agree with. Freedom Evolves, yeah. Which I happen to agree with, because his statement is that we become more and more free. And so I agree with this idea that because we are of the nature, let's say, to be agents, that we have agency, we are endowed somehow with this agency. We would imagine somebody who's unaware of that agency, or someone can grow increasingly aware of that agency. So we say like a child or a baby, they're not aware of their agency. They have to, and then, in the old days, and women were repressed, whatever, and then they have to become aware of this, female consciousness or racial consciousness. They have to become aware of their agency. It's a kind of evolving, it's kind of growth. It doesn't mean that a child or a woman in the old days didn't have agency, because they had the agency there. It was just not exercised. They weren't aware of this faculty. So it's kind of like a faculty. And even if they are not aware of the faculty, so they don't act as if they are free, they still have the capacity for this agency. They're still agents, even if they're not aware of their agency. And the whole point of human evolution, the whole point of being a human, is to grow into this agency, to grow into this awareness that you are an agent. And I think that's the one part I agree with Daniel Dennett on. Although he uses this term of freedom different than me. I mean it in a metaphysical way. I mean it like down to the bottom of reality, there is something called agency. And he uses it more like something like, it's really not clear exactly what he means by his when he talks about freedom, because he doesn't actually think we are selves, that we have there's something called the self, and that self has agency. But he does seem to think that we can make choices.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I find Dennett a little bit unclear on this too. And that's one problem with a term like self-control, which he uses, which is what is the self that's controlling? Or yeah, what does the control emanate from? I mean, that gets into a
Before
difficult.
jumping into more of these things about like the self-control, I was thinking about determinism, because you sent out uh, Google Docs with a bunch of definitions for determinisms. I pulled out a few,
Sure.
also a few other ones. So we'll see like if we can clearly understand what the determinist position is. And I have some quotes here. This is something, I don't know who said this, but if you could measure all the atoms in the universe, you would know what I would have for breakfast tomorrow. So, something to that extent. The another concept is could not have done otherwise. So there's only one possibility. So this is also, I think, predeterminism. There's only one exact physically possible future, and only one possible timeline exists. That's one way. One quote you had was pretty interesting from Mark Twain. Whatsoever man is due to his make, and to the influences brought to bear upon it by his heredities, his habit, his associations. He is moved, directed, commanded by exterior influences solely. He originates nothing, not even a thought. I think that pretty much sums up what a determinism is.
Yeah. Yeah. So determinism is a complicated position too. And this is partly because cause and effect is a very, well, like free will, it's a thing that means many things, has meant many things to many people. One of the things that I like about Kevin Mitchell's book, Free Agents, is that he points out clearly that there are these different kinds of determinism. So he mentions physical determinism, which is the idea that there's only one possible path from the past to the future. Causal determinism, so every event is necessarily caused by preceding events. Biological determinism, that's more like Sapolsky's position, where your choices are kind of determined by your physical or your biological equipment, and also your environment, of course. But like your biochemistry and your neurology and all of that goes into, and how that was formed goes into kind of deciding your decisions for you. Yeah, so there are all these different forms of determinism. I think one way, so you mentioned compatibilism. I think there's a sense in which compatibilism makes sense. This is another pragmatist idea, but it's not so much of Dennett's form of compatibilism. So one way, the kind of one close parallel to the free will determinism debate is the mechanism teleology debate, which has also gone on since at least under that name, it's gone on since the 19th century at least. And there was a big, well, a number of debates about, can these be reconciled? Mechanism here being not machine, but one branch of science dealing with mechanics. So basically reducing things or looking at things from the perspective of space, time, and mass, principally. Sometimes you would look at energy or other forces, but kind of it's centered around space, time, and mass, looking at points and how they relate to each other across space and time. So very kind of like causal picture of the world.
Yeah.
And that kind of physics comes out of that, possibly chemistry. There's debates about how the different sciences relate to each other. But mechanics in that sense is like how things kind of mechanically relate to each other, not about machines per se. And how does that relate to something like biology or psychology or sociology? And this is, of course, a difficult question. I do think it is resolvable. I do think there's a way to look at life as coming out of not life, right? I think that's partly what is behind this question. What makes life different from non-living things, which we can look at just as mechanistic. You can give equations for how rocks roll down hills. You can give equations for how planets move and all of that. You can give equations for a person falling down a hill, but what does that tell you all you want to know about a person. So then there's all these other, and how do those things relate? Those other questions about purpose, about meaning, about value, how do those relate to these more mechanistic questions? And I think something like emergence, you have to think about something like emergence. There can be new stuff, right, in the universe. It's not just all mechanism. You can get new things.
So you think a compatibilist view is incorporating a concept of emergence?
Not necessarily, but I think you could. I'm not quite sure about Dennett's views on that, for example. I don't know if all compatibilists would view it in that way, but I think you could. One way of resolving this free will indeterminism thing as a kind of compatibilism would be to kind of recast it more as mechanism and teleology. And at some point, there's a switch where you get purposeful organisms, or you get organisms, right? Living things emerging out of non-living matter. And once that gets started, you're kind of into a new realm where now you start being able to explain things in terms of purpose, in terms of action, behavior. And
so the idea of emergence is quite interesting. I mean, I guess it would be a most compatibilist view if fundamentally there is no agency, but there is an emergence of agency. I mean, I guess it's kind of merging the two views, but I have this, so I have this idea. So for a determinist or let's say a pragmatist, such as yourself, is the way you see the world, or the way you see humans interacting with the world, or this thing called the self. One idea is that there's like a glass. We are behind the self. The self is behind the glass, watching and perhaps being deceived, thinking that it's the one making decisions, when it is just believing a story the brain says. The brain says, hey, I just moved this, I just picked up this cup to drink. And the self behind the glass is like, oh yeah, I picked up the cup to drink. But actually there's a glass there. The self didn't do anything. It's just fed a story. Like one of the podcasts was talking about the driver in a self-driving car. That's one idea. So there is something there that is experiencing something, even though it is not the cause of that experience. It's not causing anything. The other idea is that that ghost behind the glass is not even real. It's just an illusion. There is no ghost. There is no self behind the glass. Not only do we not cause the actions, there's nothing called us that is thinking it's causing the actions. And that would take us a little bit more to Sam Harris's kind of view, which actually Sapolsky too, because they both, it seems to me that most determinists, by definition, will have to deny a concept of the self. And that gives us in tricky waters. So where would you be on that, from the ghost behind the glass to the ghost being an illusion? Where would you fit into as far as this thing that thinks that it's making choices?
I do think that we make choices. One of the things that pragmatists have insisted on is that freedom is a quality of the whole person. It's something that belongs not to the brain, say, or something else, but it belongs to the whole person as a cultural being, as a biological and cultural being. So it's so self in that sense is just the person, which is a kind of biological creature which has exists in a certain kind of society with a certain kind of culture, which gives it a certain strategies for dealing with the world, a certain range of choices of things to choose from. And I do think we deliberate. I do think we make choices. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a kind of illusion, as Harris would say. I don't think things are just decided by our brain. That's a common, but for me, a kind of odd kind of reductionism, where it's like you're just your brain. Like, I've never even seen my brain, I don't know. Don't know what it's doing. I don't know what's up there, but I do see my body. I am, aware of myself as kind of a biological and physical person. And, I can listen to my thoughts or make my thoughts. I can deliberate about things and choose things. So yeah, I'm not kind of like a ghost in machine kind of person. I'm not like, we're just spectators I mean, I guess you could try to experience the world that way. Sometimes Sam Harris claims to experience the world that way, I think, where you're just kind of an observer watching things happen. But I'm not convinced that that is a useful way of actually looking at the world.
Okay.
I don't know. How would you
Well, I
see
guess
yourself?
so. You keep using this term, or we keep using this term about besides free will is the idea of choice, and it seems that some people are making a distinction between those two concepts. So I guess like we could try to figure out what do we mean when we say things like free will and things like choices. And I have an idea for it, but before that idea, I would like to throw in the term of consciousness, because obviously that when we talk about free will, it's somehow connected to consciousness. And to me, a difficulty with determinism is this concept of consciousness, which seems very self-apparent. And one issue of it is that consciousness is transcendent to determinism in that there is no way to get behind consciousness. I think this is one of the founders of quantum physics. His quote is that everything we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So even when we talk about determinism, we are standing on consciousness, on a concept of consciousness to talk about it. So whatever consciousness is, it's bigger than determinism. That's one way that determinism is, one way that consciousness is transcendent to this concept called determinism. And then we have this idea of choices and unmoved mover. So I'm still trying to decide what exactly my position is in regards to this, but as I see it, when we talk about an agent, we mean something that is able to generate action, to generate a mover. And so I really like this quote that you had by, I forgot which philosopher it was, but it's funny because I wrote this quote down, basically my own version of it, and then I read what you sent me, and I was like, oh, it's the exact same thing. But it's the idea of the unmoved mover, right? So if consciousness is in itself an unmoved mover, that's it's a godlike attribute. And this quote here is, if you're responsible, and if what I've been trying to say is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we act, is a prime mover, unmoved. So I think when we talk about free will, we mean, well, okay, when metaphysicians talk about free will, they mean precisely that which can generate action. So it's the idea that, let's say, if you use quantum physics terms, is you have the idea of like a field of potential. Like fundamental reality, the ground of all being, God or whatever, is this field of potential. And in this field of potential, whatever this thing called agency is, it generates action. So it's not like there's a web of cause and effect, and we are just in that web, without any agency. We generate causes, or we add causes into the causal chain of events. So that's one way of saying the unmoved mover. But then there's the other kind of different concept of choice, which would be in this field of potentials. Let's say there's an infinite range of potentials, but they already are existing. They're all existing simultaneously. And agency is what selects one path out of those multiple paths. So in that action, it's not generating something new. It is selecting out of what is already there. So I guess those are two concepts, two ways of thinking about this agency thing. One is choosing between alternate realities. So solidifying a path in a superposition, solidifying one particular path. Another idea is that in this causal chain of events, it is introducing new causes. I think my position, at least currently right now, would be that both of those are true. Both of those are what we talk about when we say agency. Not only is it solidifying one path, like the observer watching the electrons pass through in that particular slit experiment. So not only are they solidifying one path, but they also are able to generate a cause into a deterministic universe. I suppose you would disagree with both of those positions, or?
Yeah, I think it depends for me on how you state it. I mean, the idea of the unmoved mover is difficult for me. I would maybe want to look at it like the difference between, say, choosing kind of standard options. Your culture, for example, provides, or your society provides you with a range of jobs you could take, right? There's these jobs that exist, and you could choose one of those, and that's kind of making a choice among what is already there.
Okay, so if there's a determinist system with, as the determinists say, only one possible path, then what is choice doing? What is choice must be something that is fundamental to this reality system. If there's like two choices, let's say chocolate and vanilla, and it's indeterminate, what is let's say going to be chosen. If that's indeterminate, that choice itself, and this is my position, that choice is fundamental to reality. That reality itself is choice dependent, agency dependent. So that would make sense. Like if there was multiple jobs that culture gives you, whatever, if you are able to choose a job, then it must be that fundamental reality is choice dependent. The path of reality must depend on agency, or maybe it doesn't have to depend, or just keep flowing, but an agent can modify it. And if an agent can modify that path, then it must be that the agent is fundamental reality, or is at the level of fundamental reality.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I don't quite subscribe to the concept of fundamental reality. I mean, I think choice is fundamental for human reality. But that's not the only level of reality that you can look at. But
Okay, so yeah, we go back to the emergent. So you're saying at the reality, the human reality level, choice, the agent is fundamental to that reality, and therefore you can choose a different job. I guess the same thing.
I mean, the point I was making with that is, like, you can select among standard alternatives, but you can also create a new alternative, right? If the job, like in our society, if the job you want isn't there, you can kind of create your own new thing. And that's kind of a question. Where does this kind of newness come from? And I think there are naturalistic explanations for how, in a way, you create something out of nothing, right? You create this new path through life that wasn't there before, that wasn't given you by your society, wasn't given you by tradition. And I think there are explanations of that. So that's kind of what I was trying to illustrate by that choice, is what a naturalistic version of the unmoved mover might come down to is like creative behavior, creating something new that wasn't already given to you by your society.
So that would be the distinction between choice, which would be society gives you 3 job options, and unmoved mover, which would be you create a new option. But when we use the word choice and create, either you have to have, like you say, like an emergent idea, which is like the level of quantum physics is that the tree actually doesn't exist. There's just particles with a bunch of space in between. But in our human world, we see things called trees. So that's it's like 2 different levels of reality. So if we have a human level of reality, then yes, the agent is free, makes choices, constrained or unconstrained to whatever degree, but they are able to make choices because in the human world, they are fundamental. And then you're separating that from let's say the real world, which underlies the human world, pre-emergent world that is underlying the human world. Would that be your position?
I think so.
How could you say that we are choosing it? Like, how does that work? That if the future is indeterminate and there's 2 possible outcomes, and we are what makes reality shift from one outcome to another outcome, doesn't that sound like reality is dependent on us?
Yeah.
That we are, yeah.
But yeah, as reality as far as we know. I mean, I think after life comes along, then choice is part of reality and does matter to reality and does change reality. You could try to imagine kind of what do they call it, the pre-biotic world or whatever, where I imagine, I don't know, I suspect at least according to how I used words, there would be no choice in kind of a prebiotic world. But then once you do get that emergence of life, then I think that is part of reality, and choice does affect reality, because the choices we make, I mean, this is one of the things about kind of the difference between mechanistic and teleological accounts. And E.A. Singer, a philosopher I like, used just a minor example, used the example of Brutus killing Caesar. And there's a mechanistic way to look at that as kind of atoms moving through other atoms. But that's not necessarily what we want to know about when we want to know, why did Brutus kill Caesar? It's not because these atoms bumped into these atoms, but there's this whole other level of explanation that becomes part of reality once life gets started.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess it's kind of like at some point it gets into semantics, because so for Wheeler is one of the great figures of quantum physics, and he has agreed that, I mean, a position that I agree with, which is we live in a participatory universe, so that we solidify the path in the future, but also to the past. So in the past, let's say in the world you're talking about, the world was indeterminate. Not only was there consciousness not, or choice not really there, it was indeterminate until consciousness came into this world. And then the path in history, the path of the past, was solidified. So we are creating not only the future, but the past. And this is an idea from quantum physics. And is an idea that I agree with, in that emergentist, a person who believes in emergence, they will say that usually they are talking about, okay, there is like one world, let's say H2O, and then there's a wetness of water, right? That's the two worlds of emergence. But at some point it becomes semantics. Now, what do we mean that there is a fundamental reality, that's H2O, and then the wetness of water is just a secondary reality? It really exists, but only exists at a secondary level. It's like a second class reality. For me, it'd be like, even if we talk about something like emergence in this quantum physics concept, where it's like the world is indeterminate or in a state of superposition until consciousness comes and solidifies a path, that might be one way of saying emergence. But not only would that be strong emergence, that would be something like bigger or stronger than strong emergence. So we have weak emergence, strong emergence, and that would be something like supernatural emergence. And so I would agree with that position, in that there is some kind of teleological growth or evolution through this reality structure, even if the past had no consciousness or no choice or no agency, or if it did, but that agency was in potential, because we couldn't say it didn't have it, because it, just like the acorn, it has the tree inside itself in potential, even though it's not there in the past. I would say that the agency or the agent was there in the past and just was only there in potentiality until it came into being. So therefore, we could merge an idea of emergence with an idea of free will.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, and this is a question I'm not too sure about. Like, I wonder, how probable was it that life would begin, right? What were the under what conditions does it become probable that life would begin? Is it always a potential there? And was it always a potential of the universe? Or
well, it would have to have been a potential of the universe,
well,
because we're here. So it somehow would have to be a potential.
Right, but what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, is it as
I mean, either it
strong
happens
potential?
or it doesn't. Like, it happens or it doesn't. But yeah, so I'm not quite sure how to think about that kind of issue.
Okay,
but
maybe we could talk a little bit about these underlying motivations or assumptions that these different positions have.
Okay, maybe
specifically, sure, yeah.
Yeah, before maybe we do that, to get out of before we get out of the choice issue, I'll see if I can share there's just one way that I think about choice and in relation to, so I shared you with this, of course, but
okay, I can see it.
Just put it on the screen So just one way to think about choice and relation to biology and different life forms. And this comes out of various people's work. These are not exactly my own ideas. And also the relation with consciousness.
Yeah.
So, and you can start really anywhere, but I do have the idea of, so I do tend to think about different degrees of freedom. And as you get different systems, different biological systems, and eventually different artificial systems, perhaps AIs and so on, you get different kinds of freedom or different degrees of freedom with respect to the environment. So I think when life comes along, you get a certain kind of freedom from the effects of the second law, what we call the second law of thermodynamics. So you get a freedom from just being at the mercy of your environment, at the mercy of just environmental degradation, erosion, disintegration. So you persist, right? You become able to persist by storing energy, seeking out sources of energy, reproducing. So you get a kind of freedom in that sense that, say, a stone doesn't have, which is just at the total mercy of its environment.
Yeah.
And then when I think
if you show us there on the left, I guess you just tell us the terms there. They're reactive, goal-seeking. So I guess the one at the bottom would be what we call a human, with the
last two I would
most
say,
freedom.
Yeah, would be
At
human.
some point, there would be something like animals, and then
yeah. So animals, you start to get distance perception. So at the first level, you'd have something like contact perception. Like we humans still have this. Like when something touches you, you feel it. You have a reaction. And then with animals, you start getting seeing, hearing, smelling could be considered as a distance form of perception, where you're freed from like stuff immediately touching you. That could be harmful, right? You're able to now be free with respect to predators that you might see from far away. You can see sources of food that are farther away. So you have more freedom from starvation, for example. So you're not just always missing the food source. You can look into the distance and see it or smell it from far away and go towards it, right? This is related to behavior also. And then you start getting humans and you get symbols and you get freed from your immediate environment. Now you can talk about the future. You develop symbols. Symbols can represent things that are not there right then in your environment. You can talk about the future. You can talk about the past. And so this is where more like what we think of as human freedom comes from. So when we're making a decision, we're constructing a future for ourselves using symbols, right? We're imagining what will the future be like if I make this choice. And that's based on symbol use. Or, I mean, you would call this a kind of consciousness. And I think this is a particular kind of consciousness. I kind of try to avoid the word consciousness because it has it comes in at all those levels, but in different ways, right? You could define it differently according to each of these levels. But I think human reflective consciousness or reflective experience, symbolic consciousness is really what we mean when we're talking about human agency and making choices. And then I even have a level for ideal seeking, which is actually freeing yourself from any situation conceivable, right? Having an ideal, like I'm going to become the best ever at this thing, or we're going to continually improve society, right? This is not like something that is achievable necessarily in 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, but it's an ideal that you can maybe get closer and closer to, but never achieve. And that kind of goes beyond actual time and space, measurable time and space. And so this is, I think,
reminds me
another
of
important.
Peterson's definitions of free will about like the closer you are in a time bound, the less freedom you have. The further you go into the future, the more freedom you have. Interesting.
Yeah.
But I also do see it's quite, like you mentioned, consciousness. It's also similar to like I wouldn't say development of consciousness, but a capacity for consciousness, right?
Yeah,
So you
I think
have
you
your
do.
once you have your hearing, seeing, smelling. That's a I guess it's freedom, but it's also very much tied in with this concept of consciousness development.
Yeah, I tend to think of it more in terms of perception or experience, because at least to me, they're more concrete. Um, but you could substitute, I think, the word consciousness. So earlier biologists and stuff would talk about, contact reception or contact sensation, distance perception. So I think consciousness maybe adds a little confusion to at least these lower levels, because it's not consciousness like humans would often think of it, where you're having inner thoughts and thinking about
yeah, I
what
guess
to
that's
do.
another word too. We have to like try to define as a consciousness. I guess when we talk about the self, see, my idea of using the word self or consciousness, which I use interchangeably, is that there is some locus of experience. There's something. So even though, like Harris, for instance, he talks about the self being an illusion, but he always at every time means that whatever, even his most meditative experiences, means that there is something experiencing whatever state that is. There's an experience of a state, even if that state is pure awareness, whatever else. There's some kind of locus of that experience, and that's localized in one particular body. So whatever, like if he meditates, I'm not going to have this experience. His whatever experience he's having is within his own self. So it's subjective in that sense. Even though his experience might be like, oh, I transcended and I'm the one with the universe. Okay, but it's still only reported by you. So it's still an experience located in from one focal point. And so like if something touches you, right, or if you have a sense of smell or vision or sight, whatever that thing that is the receptor, right, the receiver of that sense is what I call consciousness or the self, which would be very obviously different from this term of like ego, self as ego, or self as a formed character or some kind of construct. So it's interesting, but I still see that so back again to what I mentioned in the beginning about there's two levels. One is talking about free will or agency as a faculty, and free will as agency as exercising of that faculty. So with this example, like you have here on the screen, this is all exercising of a faculty or the descripting. We could imagine that whatever this self is that underlies, the goal seeking, objective seeking, because it's, even though the word is not used here, it's all predicated on a concept of something. Something is having sight, something is having sense of hearing, something is doing this. So it's all predicated on this thing. And whatever that thing is, we'd say that thing has the capacity or the faculty of these words called freedom to varying degrees. And the degrees, I suppose, to me, would be more like the exercising of that capacity. But the question is, does anything in the universe have this capacity, this faculty of freedom? If it does, that would mean that reality itself is dependent, or it is agency dependent, right? I don't know if there's any way to get around saying that. If at any point in time the system is indeterminate, or if at any point in time the system has, the only other explanation you have for this is randomness, which is a separate issue. But if at any point in time, okay, leaving aside randomness, at any point in time there is something intending reality to shift, then whatever that is fundamental to reality. I don't think we can get around that argument. Although we could say like this idea of freedoms and varying degrees of freedom, I think that still we're talking about the exercising of that faculty. But if something underlying that has a faculty of choosing, even if free will maybe is too extreme, we could use the word choosing. Even if it could choose, then we have defended free will.
Yeah, again, I wouldn't necessarily use the term free will. I mean, these degrees of freedom that I talk about, so there are things that could be exercised. They don't need to be exercised to be there. I mean, you can close your eyes, or people can be blind or whatever. And they might have the potential for sight, like we can sometimes replace help blind people to see. So you have a kind of a potential for vision, but you might not be able to exercise it for one or another reason, which I think is why kind of pragmatists and the conscientious scientists would tend to look at large groups of things that seem to be similar.
So would a pragmatist would just ignore that? Would a pragmatist ignore that by saying like let's say we say, okay, so a blind person, let's say everybody in the world was blind, and when someone made it an idea, well, perhaps we are that creature that is capable of sight, even though we don't exercise this because we have no eyes. So let's say perhaps this goes into like how you understand this concept of evolution. I think Teilhard, one of the mystics of the Catholic tradition, his idea of evolution is that so God is evolving in nature towards this kind of consciousness. And therefore, let's say a creature without eyes, let's say, it's still because it's teleologically directed to become consciousness, right? It is of the nature, it has a potential for this sight, even though it has no eyes. So would a pragmatist be like, well, it does not matter, like, would just ignore that argument, ignore the argument that you have the capacity, the faculty argument, and they're talking more about the behavior. So they don't care whether humans are that which has a faculty or the capacity for free will. It's, well, what are humans doing? Are they free or not free in their actions? Is that the level of analysis for a pragmatist?
I think so. And it kind of gets, so another way maybe of looking at this, I mean, it's the emergence question again, and it's kind of like, is color an essential part of the universe? Or did color only come into existence when color vision emerged?
Yeah, okay.
And I would, yeah, and I don't know exactly how to how to answer that. I mean, obviously, the universe was compatible with some biological feature that allowed creatures to see color. So there was light reflecting off stuff, and this could be translated into color for certain kinds of organisms. I mean, would we want to say that color, therefore, was kind of like a necessary potential or a fundamental potential in reality, irrespective of that? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that for me, it really matters how we answer the question. I mean, for pragmatists, novelty happens, and you can't, by definition, you can't predict novelty, but you can explain it looking backwards. I think this is kind of the truth of determinism, that once something new happens, you can then explain it, but you can never perfectly explain it, right? I think a total causal picture is beyond anything we can do. A total explanation of any phenomena, it would basically mean explaining the universe, and then where did the universe come from and all of that. So I mean, but the kind of the kernel of truth in determinism is that once something new happens, we can basically get a good enough explanation that maybe we can predict it, maybe we can create it again. But by definition, you can't really predict the novel. I mean, color
Yeah, I mean,
vision
this is tricky
happened,
stuff
but
because like I mentioned about Wheeler and solidifying the past, once consciousness comes into being, it solidifies the past, and therefore we have an explanation for the past. But the explanation for the past didn't exist until we existed it. We willed it into existence.
Right.
So even if a new something new comes into the structure and we have an explanation for it, doesn't mean it would be deterministic. It just means that we overlaid a history onto that new thing. The new thing created its own history.
Yeah, and that's that's basically one of the major themes of one book that I really like, which I happen to have a paper copy of, so I'll just show it, called
what is that one?
Modern Science and Human Freedom
Oh, okay.
by a guy named David Miller, who was a student of George Herbert Mead. And this is one of the big themes of the book, is that basically the past new things create their own pasts, right? We don't
Okay,
have
interesting. Yeah.
you don't have a past for that thing until it comes, and then you look, why did this event happen? Why did this new skill come about? Why did this new life form come about? The past of it doesn't exist until it exists and people start asking those questions. And so therefore the past is always changing as well, because you're always telling it from the perspective of the present, which involves new things, new perspectives. So the past in a way is never like a fixed thing, at least.
Yeah.
I mean, you can maybe posit it. Yeah, I don't even know what it means to like say that the past exists irrespective of our attempts to explain anything. I mean, once things happen, once
And
the
that goes
past
to the
happens, it's
other
gone, right? The present disappears when it gets on
that
to the
goes to the
next
other
moment.
problem of
So
you can never get behind consciousness, which is
yeah,
another
or
problem that specifically for determinists have. And so this part about the motivations and underlying assumptions for these particular points of view, as I see it, most of the people who are determinists are also against agency, or not against it, but they deny agency or the self, this thing called the self. And that's because everything that we do is based on consciousness. I mean, the fact that we can have conversations, the fact that we can decide whether determinism is true or false, that's all based on our thinking, and that's all based on conscious. Even our idea of like science and cause and effect, those are all conscious dependent concepts. So it's really tricky. It's like a person, the picture of the person sawing the branch off while standing on the branch. It's kind of people who deny the self while being a self. I find it to be a little bit problematic, but I do see, specifically, I'm not so sure about the other one, specifically first though, Harris and Sapolsky. Harris, of course, his no self or his denial of self comes more from Buddhism. Sapolsky's denial of the self comes more from atheism, but both, kind of reach a similar, I would say similar, but not totally similar, because Sam Harris, I think in some place he says he's not actually a materialist, in that he's open to the possibility, like a Buddhist possibility of something like consciousness. And I think Sapolsky would be very much a materialist, right? So I guess that's where they differ. But they both agree, I think, in the denial of something called the self, what we will call a self, which is also another word that's problematic, this thing called the self. And specifically, I'm interested in that. Why? Because I see that you also have a kind of different interpretation of the self. The self for you is what, like the whole body. It's not like a ghost in the machine concept. There's no real self. There's more like just what the body does. Would that be how you describe the self?
yeah, I mean, that would be one way. I've tried anyway in general, I try to avoid these words that have so many different meanings that you never know what you're talking about. I have so far retained a very narrow use of the word self in kind of my own work, which is more about interests, your interests and the skills related to those interests, which you can differentiate from role. But normally, when other people are talking about the self, I think when you're talking about the self, I tend to just think of the organism, the body, that is the locus, the location of its experiences. And that's maybe a little bit too simple, because I mean, it's always in contact with the rest of the world. But yeah, I don't see, I don't know what to make of kind of this more traditional or maybe more mysterious notion of the self. And I don't know, maybe so there's motivations for and against it. I mean, my motivation against the concept of self is that it's just, too many different meanings and you never quite know what you're talking about. Um, so yeah, I guess I would want maybe from you would be like a more concrete, I don't know, I would want like a more specific or concrete picture of what the self means. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what Harris is rejecting if he rejects a self. I don't know that Sapolsky has said much about this. In particular, I think rejecting free will is not exactly the same as rejecting the self, but I know you see them as closely tied together, closely connected. I don't know what.
Well,
Maybe do you want to say more about?
If everything is determinate, right, for Sapolsky, right, if everything's determinate, then the only options would be either we are the driver in the self-driving car, or the ghost behind the glass, experiencing, observing what is going on, but not interacting with it. But obviously, as he is a materialist atheist, that obviously go against his view. I mean, so I guess I'm going to be more inferring what he believes, and rather than everything he actually said. But I guess I would imagine that he would deny what libertarians will call a self, or what I would call this self. And I guess it is kind of tricky talking about this concept of self, I guess. But for me, I equate it with I use the term consciousness and the self interchangeably. And for me, this consciousness, it can be described by having this like triune attributes of awareness, experientiality, and agency. So the Buddhists and Sam Harris, they talk a lot about this concept of awareness. You're aware of something, but they leave out the concept of agency, which I think they're missing. And like two sides of the same coin, on one side you have awareness, experientiality, and agency. On the other side, you have the observer. There is an observer to the observing. Like there is to any experience, there is the experiencer. To any act, there is the actor. So these might be terms we use, but talking about the same thing. And I think that this thing that is aware, that experiences, and that moves, that has agency, or that acts, is what I call the self. And this is kind of a foundational self. And this would differ from something called the ego or formed character. A formed character or ego is something that we construct. By we, I mean something this fundamental self constructs. But I also disagree, I guess, with people of the Sam Harris persuasion that this character is either an illusion or something to get past. So the Buddhist concept, right, to get past this ego's construct, let's say. But I'm more of like on the position of Carl Jung, the psychotherapist, who's more, his position is no, not to do away with the ego, but to create an even stronger ego that can survive mystical experiences or whatever experiences he was talking about, that the world will throw experiences at you. If you are totally aware of the world, right, it will overwhelm you with its majesty. And the goal is to create this self that can endure that. So I guess that'd be the biggest, I think the biggest the underlying conflicts within this so people talk about free will and determinism, usually at the level of free will and determinism. They don't realize that there is an underlying conflict going on. And I think this underlying conflict has to do with something called the consciousness and the self. For some people who don't agree with who deny consciousness or a self, that obviously they would deny free will, because there's nothing doing the free will if there is no thing there. And I don't know, okay, not specifically about materialism, because that's a separate issue, but for Sam Harris and his position of the no self, I see that more as some kind of misinterpretation. So Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. Hinduism has this idea of what's the idea of, okay, I don't know what the Hindu term is, but it's Atman. Atman is the self, the big self. So each person has Atman, the true self in each person. But this Atman is very similar to, or it's identical to Brahman, which is God self. So for the Hindus, there is true self. Buddhism comes around and denies self, but I think they're denying the different kind of self. So there are branches of Buddhism that don't say no self, they say true self. But mainstream Buddhism says no self. And I believe that this is a misconception in Buddhism. I think Buddhists are confused about this concept. But I think I've read some articles by some Buddhist monks who say, well, actually, that's like this conflict between these two terms, no self and true self. Actually, it means they're talking about the same thing. Like they're using different words, but they actually mean the same thing. So maybe I agree with that. But I think that this term no self has gotten us confused a bit. And I think in this case is what Sam Harris is doing is he's using this term, or has this idea of the self being an illusion. But I think what those people who said the self is an illusion, I think that they're talking about something different than what the Hindus talk about when they say the word Atman or true self. I think they're talking about two different selves.
Right.
And I don't think whatever Sam Harris's experiences he explained, he never denies the true self. He never denies that there is something experiencing something. And he's open to the idea that that could be fundamental reality. So he's not specifically a determinist. I mean, not specifically materialist. So what would your position be in relation to that? I mean, do you think there is? See, it's tricky because even if you say like the word unchanging self, like, do you think that there is something? I mean, there must be something experiencing something, but you would equate that more with the body.
Yeah, I think for me that's the body as the whole. Maybe one. So there's an interesting distinction you brought up, which I think is important, which is, I mean, I don't know how to think about it in my own kind of terminology or philosophy, but the distinction between character and self. And this was also made by one of the, in the document I sent you by C.A. Campbell in his book, Selfhood and Godhood. And he defines free will, I think a little similar to you, maybe, or maybe quite similarly, but maybe with some difference in that free actions are only those which depend solely upon the self, which he distinguishes from character and from also, of course, hereditary influences, environmental influence. So it's free actions are not those which are influenced by character, which is interesting. So not influenced by character, and of course, not influenced by hereditary environment, blah, blah, blah. But then the difficult thing has always been, I think, what exactly then is the self? If it's not your character, if it's not your biological inheritance, I mean, we're talking about something like a soul, but then how do we...
Well, I guess this is just some metaphor. I don't know if it's very helpful in explaining, but like playing piano. So let's say I want to play a piano. I want to play a song. I will myself to play certain chords. I'm doing, but once I will myself to do that, it gets into a pattern. And then later on, I can play without even thinking. So this is like a distinction between a self and what's it called? A formed character. So the self is the one who started off by, willing the body to play these chords, but in doing that has constructed a kind of algorithm. And therefore, the next time I play, I don't need to will anything. I just turn on that algorithm, and the algorithm plays for me. So this algorithm is something like an ego or a formed character. It's something that the self creates to get along in the world much more efficiently, perhaps. I don't know what the purpose of that would be. But again, I guess if we're talking about this thing called the self is still tricky. I mean, I keep going back to these ideas of having these three attributes, and agency being one of these attributes. And my position of that is that because reality itself, when we talk about this concept called reality, reality must be, at least in part, something like agency. It must be something like, I know this is similar to, I forget now which philosopher talks more about events or occurrences. Oh, Whitehead, it's Whitehead, right? And for him, reality, fundamental reality is, occurrences, events, movement, action. I'm not sure if I totally agree with his views, but it seems to me that whatever this agency is must be part of fundamental reality. Like in order to choose, in order to do something, if that doing and choosing is affecting reality, affecting the paths of reality, then it must be intimately intertwined. But I do want to just jump backwards a little bit when you were talking about the self and the body. Daniel Siegel, I think he wrote a book, something about the mind. And I don't know if he has introduced this concept, but I'm pretty sure it's been around for a while, but it's the idea of a transpersonal mind. That the mind, or the you, is not just you and your body. It also is you, like you and your son and you and your wife. Like there's a part of you that's outside your body. And it's kind of also kind of a weird mystical way of putting it. But it's kind of, there's some kind of connection between you and your family, for instance. So whatever you, when we're talking about, is not just inside you. It's transpersonal. It's beyond you. It's beyond the brain because it's in your body, like your gut, but it's also beyond the body and the brain, in that it reaches out to your social connections. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I basically agree with it. I would maybe say it in a different way, but yeah, so I talk about the body, but as kind of the site of experience, but that's a bit of a simplification because of course you're within a society and a culture that also kind of conditioned how you experience, and your actions influence the world around you, your culture, your society. So there's much more of I mean, the Deweyians will talk about transaction. So you're constantly in a the organism is in a constant transaction with its environment. So you can analytically distinguish, and it can be very useful, of course, to distinguish organisms, bodies, and their environments, but it's not really an absolute distinction because they're so, I mean, you can't have a body outside of an environment, or an organism outside of an environment and it still be an organism. It would just be lifeless gunk or whatever. So yeah, I mean, one of the ways that Dewey's ideas have been developed is in the concept of the extended mind, which kind of emphasizes this aspect, which is that because we're social creatures, and we live within kind of this symbolic culture, which is necessary to our survival, necessary to who we are, necessary to how we experience. It's not just really that we're just an isolated self or an isolated body, but we're in this whole interconnected web of things, which
I find that kind of it's hard to talk about that without postulating some. So for me, like in my presentation I had before about meaning, like the meaning as being a fundamental aspect of reality, it's hard to talk about something like transpersonal minds if we don't postulate something else besides matter and energy, or matter, let's say. If whatever this mind stuff is transacting with others, what pathway, in what way is your mind stuff traveling to another person and traveling back? Like, what is that? That's not particles, like that's something else. So I think it gets into, like, for me, I'm imagining that there must be a kind of another layer of reality that we call meaning. Maybe for a pragmatist, they would say, okay, that's like an emergent property, symbolic level of reality. It doesn't actually exist. It's just in our mind. But for me, the mind itself is something of another layer of reality.
Okay.
But I had an interesting quote. I mean, this is going off on back to the idea of underlying motivations and assumptions for people on either who are for a materialist position or free will position, or somewhere in between. This quote from James Ogilvy. I was reading one of his books that we're editing, and he has this quote because he's talking about Sartre and existentialism, and he says, "Freedom becomes an almost impossible burden. Freedom is anguished," says Sartre, "so difficult to bear that we are inclined to fall into what he calls bad faith. We are inclined to view ourselves as things, not as free, because it is easier that way. We no longer bear the burden of responsibility for our acts or for determining the values by which we judge our acts. So this is interesting because obviously the essentialists are very much, as much as I might have some difficulty with them or some issues with them, they are very much, their whole philosophy is predicated on freedom. Like that's basically their philosophy in a nutshell. And then we have, these people coming around like Sapolsky and Sam Harris who are going the complete opposite, totally denying the concept of free will or freedom or, this sense of agency. And obviously I'm not accusing them of being afraid of freedom or it's easier to view ourselves as things rather than dealing with the consequences of freedom. But I do also think that the purpose of consciousness is to be free or to be more and more free, to become more aware of this capacity, this co-creative capacity of freedom. And therefore, I see some kind of, underlying conflict between the free will and determinist people related to this idea of like, on one hand, you want to deny freedom, and what would be the purpose of denying freedom? What would be your motivation? Of course, the argument against me or my position might be, okay, why do I want this freedom? Why do I want so much to be a self? I should do some more meditation and
yeah, so I think we should maybe turn to motivations and free will. And I think it's maybe important distinction. I do want to, well, so let's turn to that. But first, just very briefly on the mind stuff topic, which you mentioned, and we should maybe do a future episode more on consciousness. But yeah, so just briefly about that, and maybe we should get into it another time. But I do think that there is maybe more simple and mundane explanations for how we transmit ideas, for example, how ideas develop, how we, transmit our thoughts and so forth, which is, they're transmitted through sound and writing and stuff like that, which are very physical, right? And this is something that we learn how to do in a particular culture, a particular society. I used to be confused about, I used to have a hard time with the concept of concept. Like, it seems very abstract. Where do they exist? One answer is they exist in the body. They exist in the wiring in your body. But the other answer is how they get transmitted. We put them, we speak them, we transmit them. They actually exist as, sound waves or as, marks on paper that we're able to interpret because we belong to the same culture and the same species and so forth. So I think there's kind of naturalistic explanations for these things, how we're able to influence others with our thoughts and so forth without positing kind of another layer or a kind of mind stuff. But there's debate about that. We can maybe discuss that another time. But yeah, maybe to finish up, because we've been talking for a pretty long time now, maybe turn to those, like, why do people take these different positions? Maybe some ethical, moral stuff. I think an interesting kind of distinction or conflation you made just before was with freedom and free will. And I think these might need to be separated. And I think it is common for people to think of these as the same thing. But as I've mentioned earlier, pragmatists mostly rejected the concept of free will as this personal, like individual kind of thing. But we still want to talk about freedom, like social freedom, political freedom. And I think Sapolsky would probably have that same view. He rejects free will as this thing that you have. And I don't know exactly if I agree with him or not, but it depends, of course, how you define these things. But I think he would still maintain that freedom in an economic and a political sense are important things, the freedom of people to not be oppressed.
This is a big area that they have, at least Sapolsky and Harris. It's about, again, another of their motivations, which is related to reward and punishment, or as they put it, to making the world a better place. even though that does sound a little bit incoherent. How do you make the world a better place if you're not doing anything, if you don't have a will to do it? But see, their idea is predicated on this notion that, well, Sapolsky for sure, like once we understand all the motivations for why people do things, we will no longer have any judgment of anybody who does anything bad, or we have no praise for anybody who does something good either, because we realize that whatever they did or didn't do is just a result of their prior biology. And if we adopt that view, our world will be a better world, because we can let go of judgment and let go of praising people. Now, I also have the same motivation. I also believe that we should get past this idea of judgment, this idea of it's a very biblical concept of judge not that you be not judged. So I also have the same motivation, but I see the determinists, they're ramping up a terrible product under this with this ramping of like, the world would be better if we just didn't have any freedom, if we didn't have any free will. Let's put it like, if there was no free will, then no one will get judged and no one would get praised, right? It would be much happier, more egalitarian. But I think you can reach that goal of not judging without giving up free will and agency. And okay, so I guess we'll just a few more things before we end about, okay, if I saw one of the Sapolsky's podcasts, and he was talking about, so they would still agree. So he would still agree, like if somebody did something bad, you still put them in prison, but you would put them in prison because it's more of a mechanistic thing. This person is likely to do this, and therefore you must put them in this box so they can't do those things. But we get rid of all of the moralizing of it, like, oh, you're a bad person because you did this. What would you think the implication of free will determinism would be on something like the justice system, or our sense of justice? And second to that is the concept of morality. Can you have good and bad concepts if there is no free will? But anyways, yeah, first let's go with the justice system. How would that work?
Yeah, this is the part of Sapolsky that I actually like, although, as I said, I kind of reject the basic free will versus determinism framing.
Yeah.
So I would kind of reject how he talks about determinism and free will, although I think his work is really, really useful I think that's part of freedom, is understanding all the influences on you. And if you understand when you're hungry, you're going to make bad decisions, well, you can take that into account. And in a sense,
and you become more free.
More free. Yeah. But I think like my appreciation in a way of his kind of the moral implications are maybe separate from whether I think he's right or wrong about free will. And I think other people that I admire, Dewey, other people in the early 20th century, Theodore de Laguna, they said all you really need is an instrumental view of reward and punishment. You don't need to, it doesn't matter whether we have free will or not in that sense. Like all that matters is what can you do to, what effects do praise and blame have on future behavior? That's all we really need to know. Like, will punishing this person in this way make them less likely to do this bad thing again? Will praising someone in this way make them more likely to do this good thing again? That's all really that matters. And it doesn't matter whether we posit free will or no free will or self or no self, or it's just, I think reward and punishment can be thought of in a purely pragmatic, purely instrumental way. And these kind of metaphysical debates don't really need to matter for that part. But I don't know, what do you think about that?
I mean, I think we are instinctively, like, we are creatures of meaning, and so we want to have meaning. We could, I mean, there is this idea of ritual, like just going through the motions. Like, let's say, okay, we realize that if we all stand up and say, hey, so-and-so is a bad person, then that will have an effect of making the person not do a particular action. Even though the person standing up and saying you're a bad person there's no meaning behind it. It's just like an algorithm saying the words. So it's possible, and I think this is a lot like the old days of ritual. A lot of ritual stuff is like this. I think a lot of ritual is there's not necessarily a dogmatic belief behind the ritual. The ritual is just more like a procedure that has a certain kind of effect. I mean, for me personally, I would like a world where there is no judgment, there is no punishment, there is no, these concepts, we can move past these concepts. I'm very much anti-death penalty. I'm very much anti-prison. I think prisons are barbaric institutions. But of course, you run into the problem of like, okay, what if someone's running around shooting people? What are you going to do about this? And I think this is, I mean, I think there is what you do as in a practical sense. You have to be pragmatic in some way. But there's also the ideal, the goal that you are aiming for. And a goal I think we're aiming for is to have a world without this moralizing of behavior, because the more we realize how much is influenced, the more free we can be, and the more free from judgment we can be, the more free we can be to not judge others. But this is why specifically I disagree with Harris and Sapolsky about this concept of how we get to that better world. They get to the better world by denying free will and agency. And I would reject that completely, because my position is that we choose, and this also goes again, at least for Harris, the idea of his background in Buddhism and tradition was like, there is no self, and we have to move past this to get past suffering. So the goal is to avoid the suffering. But I think the Western tradition is very much the opposite. The goal is not to avoid the suffering. The goal is to endure the suffering rather than betray our desires. So rather than betray our desire to be an agent, to be free, we need to embrace the suffering that comes with being an agent and being free in order to transcend it. And there's this movie called Equilibrium, where it's like in the future, everybody takes the pills, they don't have any emotions. And then they ended war, they ended jealousy, they ended everything, right? But they also ended art. They ended anything beautiful about being a human. That's the whole movie. And I think Sam Harris and Sapolsky's where they will take us, if they had their way, where they would take us is a world like Equilibrium, where people don't have any of those things. In fact, they also will kill everything beautiful about being human. And I think my goal is that we could have both, that we could have the beauty of being human. We could endure the suffering until we get past it, into a world where we don't have this kind of judgment and punishment and this desire for revenge. But I do have one final point about, I know it's getting late, but about the implications of this free will determinism debate. Besides the moral one, there is also the technological one. What would happen if technocrats, let's say Sam Harris and Sapolsky, were in charge of building AI systems or in charge of in Google or whatever, if they did not have a view that humans have agency, they might not view technology that could reduce our agency as a threat. And I think this is a problem, because it's possible, like this idea of social media, TikTok or whatever, inhibiting our capacity, our faculty of free will and agency. So we have on one side, we have media doing that. On the other side, it is possible to think, like Elon Musk and his Neuralink, it's possible to think of actually developing technologies that will have a biological impact on our capacity, our faculty of agency and free will. But if someone doesn't believe that we have free will to begin with, then they wouldn't view things like Neuralink or the possibility of taking that into a different direction. They wouldn't necessarily view that as a threat, because if we don't have free will, then things that might biologically change us by removing some kind of faculty of free will, it wouldn't be viewed that as a threat. Now, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do kind of find Sam Harris a bit inconsistent in his determinism on the one hand, and then finding consciousness really mysterious on the other. And how can you be sure about one thing and not sure about the other? And then he's also very worried about AI, but then if things are so deterministic, why do we need to worry about AI? So I'm not, I mean, I like Sam Harris. I like listening to Sam Harris, but I, sometimes have trouble reconciling his different positions. And I don't know if it's my problem or his problem, but yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to explain
Just, I guess what he
why.
would say about his, like, why he's, let's say, concerned about AI.
Mhm.
So even though we have no choice, no free will, and everything is just determinate, um, part of what is determined is his being afraid of AI. That's determined. But his fear of AI has its own effects. He did not cause his fear of AI, but that fear of AI can have residual effects that could cause other people to be afraid and therefore in the future not have AI. Uh, but yeah, I do also have the same problem. Why would it matter whether you're afraid of something or you want something or not want something? Or how can you even say a better world? How can you even say those concepts if you are just determined? It doesn't have any meaning if it's just determined.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe in these views, as well as the like criminal justice issue, like maybe like I would just separate out those issues of determinism and free will, which for me are really highly metaphysical, um, and very difficult to nail down. And for me, at least for me personally, I don't think it matters that much when you're discussing these other issues. So I think you can tackle criminal justice reform without understanding whether or not we have free will or whether free will or not actually exists. I think Sapolsky has a little bit of this sense, like he says in his book that he doesn't expect you to totally agree with his view on free will. Maybe he'll nudge you like a little bit in this direction, but he is hoping to persuade you about reward and punishment, that we shouldn't blame people for things that are out of their control, which, I agree with. I think, blame, like I said, blame can be just purely instrumental. And I think I think AI will, and these Neuralink kinds of things, these integrating technologies with our bodies will change. I would say they will change how we make choices. They'll change maybe how we view the world and the kinds of choices we make and the kind of interpretations we make.
But
We
are
don't.
you worried that if somebody has the levers of those technologies, are you worried if they have a particular view that it might increase the danger from those technologies? So, I mean, from my point of view, if I believe in free will and the person with the levers of technology doesn't believe in free will, I might be concerned. Maybe you wouldn't be as concerned because you're not really that much into free will to begin with. But there might be other things that you hold dear that you might see as being, or as, say, for instance, if I had the levers of control of the technology to make you more free.
Well, again, I wouldn't conflate free will and freedom. So if someone had control of those levers of technological power who was kind of against freedom or against my freedom or against the freedom of this or that group to
Oh yeah, so it would distinguish
believe what
between
they want to
freedom and free
believe,
will.
or
Oh,
yeah.
I mean specifically free will. So if they have a technology capable of diminishing your capacity, not your capacity, but your faculty of free will, not to restrict your freedom, as more of a everyday sense of the word, but if there is something that could change the human being or the biology or the structure of the mind to inhibit or close off the faculty of free will, that be a concern. Or if someone doesn't
Well,
have a belief in free will, they might not think that some technologies that could inhibit free will as being a threat. Right? That would be my position
yeah.
about that.
Okay. Yeah, well, again, for me, I think it's definitely a concern for what these technologies are doing. I think even with something like social media, it does matter the kinds of views they highlight, and people are making decisions, at least in terms of building the algorithms that are making the decisions about what you see and what you don't see. And that has an effect on the kinds of choices you make, right? Because if you know something exists, if you know this range of choices exists, but you don't know about this other range of choices, that is part of your
Yeah.
freedom. And again, I don't need to tie that in with free will in my own views.
Well, see, that's free. That's freedom. So the idea of like fake
Yeah,
news and sort of stuff, that's at the level of freedom. But there's different. The
right.
other level of free will would be, is this technology, let's say TikTok, rewiring our mind structure, or is it doing something to our underlying structures, whether it's the brain or the mind? Is it doing something that is disallowing, or it's restricting our capacity or our faculty of free will? Not in the sense of, okay, fake news or like some products being sold to us. That's one level of restricting freedom or something. But the other level is it possible to do something to our entire structure that our faculty will be inhibited, our
Well, for me
capacity.
again, and for me, it's changing us definitely, and it's more at the level of, it changes how you see the world. Different media change how you see the world. Watching films changes how you see the world. Playing video games changes how you see and experience the world. Reading novels changes how you see and experience the world. So all these things are always changing you, and you could see that maybe as enhancing or diminishing, if the case may be, your free will. But I don't find it that useful to think in those terms. I would just say it's changing you. It's changing how you see things, maybe changing what you do, your likely responses that you're going to make
I
to.
guess another way to put this maybe would be like giving someone a lobotomy. Let's imagine that whatever we call free will is a faculty. I think it's a faculty of something called the soul or the self. I think the self is transcendent to the physical world. But let's just talk in biological terms and say that this faculty is structured in your brain somewhere. Whereas to the extent where if we give you a lobotomy, we have eradicated your, not eradicated, but we have greatly limited your faculty of free will. Do you think technology has a capacity for lobotomy? And do you think if people in with the levers of technology who don't believe in free will, would they not view technology that would lobotomize us as a threat? I don't mean actually lobotomize us, but I mean some technology that could impact our structure in such a way as to cut out or diminish this faculty.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I do think, there is that possibility of technology or different media in effect lobotomizing you. I think, sometimes I wonder that about my students, but I won't I won't elaborate on that point. Whether people who don't believe in free will should be worried about that. And I guess I kind of fall into that, but not in the way that most people will think. Um, so what does someone like Sapolsky worry? I think Sapolsky is, probably, I don't know if I've heard him talk about this, but I'm sure he has worries about the effects of technology on people. How would he view this from a deterministic? Well, I mean, that's part of the environmental influence, right? So he does think, of course, that your environment is one of the determinants of how you act. So if there's bad determinants from your environment, you're going to get bad actions as a result. So I think probably there's a way to answer that without positing a capacity of free will, that it's just, bad environment, right? He talks about bad prenatal environments, bad childhood environments, and so on. And the media environment or technological environment is another environment, which could be good or bad. So I think as one determinant, I think that's the way he would maybe answer that question, although I hesitate to answer for someone smarter about me than many things, that in many ways, than Robert Sapolsky. But we should maybe
Well,
try
okay,
to wrap up here. Any
all right.
last points you want to
That's pretty much it. I
emphasize?
mean, I guess the last point would be that, as I see it, all of philosophy and science is predicated on a notion of agency. I think science and philosophy would be meaningless in a deterministic universe, at least the science and philosophy as we understand them nowadays. Uh, I obviously, those Sam Harris and Sapolsky would disagree, but there's there would be no conception of science as we understand it, as we are doing something to make the world better, as a quote you mentioned before, trying to make the world better. We are affecting change in the world by doing science, right? Or philosophy. That whole notion would disappear if we lived in a deterministic universe where we're not doing anything. We are just algorithms performing actions that are predetermined. So I think the motivation of science and the motivation of philosophy is predicated on the notion that we are agents with free will. And if we remove that foundation of science and philosophy, I don't know what it would do to science and philosophy. For Sam Harris and those guys, I think, oh, it would not do anything to science, because science will just continue, just like, but I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if the structure can continue without its foundation. Anyways, with us, the last point I had there.
All right, and I think that's a very respectable position. I just, yeah, I think we can understand a lot of those things without the specific concept of free will. I mean, agency for me is maybe a good enough term that comes in when you get living things, and in humans comes in when you get symbols and can think about the future instead of just being limited to your immediate situation. So yeah, but I think
yeah, and I like that explanation. That's good.
Okay. All right. Well, that's maybe a good note to end on. So I'll stop the recording at least.